Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the nature of what's come to be known as relativism, which I sense has also become something of a scary boogeyman these days. A little bit like nihilism, it seems. Anyhow, this video is part of a larger series of videos where I'm basically looking at a whole range of phenomena that we almost always regard as negative, usually in fairly simplistic binary ways. Past videos in that series have focused on topics like dilettantism, stupidity, depression, jealousy, and yes, nihilism. I'll put some links to some of those videos in the description section of this video. As for this one, well, here's the usual roadmap of the material in it. And as usual, you can find this same roadmap in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, I'd like to explore relativism for several reasons. First and most obviously, relativism seems to be gaining a fair amount of traction within popular discourse these days, especially with respect to the issue of moral relativism. However, a deeper reason would be that relativism starts to get at a truly interesting question. What is the best way to view life's fundamental operative forces, and why? At any rate, we should probably start by developing a working understanding of what the term relativism means. But the problem with that is that people use that word in at least two very different ways to mean two very different things. And those different usages are often conflated and confused in common usage. The first of those two, which is probably the more frequent one, refers to the idea that any perspective or any interpretation or any morality is as good as any other. Basically, the idea that all views of life fall into a complete equivalence and arbitrariness. Consequently, from that point of view, Mother Teresa's or Thich Nhat Hanh's worldview would be morally equivalent to, say, Ted Bundy's or Adolf Hitler's. Being an extraordinarily intelligent, perceptive human being would be just as desirable as being an extraordinarily stupid, dull one. There'd be no statistical differences between men and women, say with regard to longevity or physical size or concentrations of different hormones in our bodies. I think you're probably getting the picture. But the problem with that particular way of defining relativism is that no sane person actually believes in it. In essence, there are no actual defenders or advocates of that kind of relativism. There are only people who attribute it to their supposed ideological opponents so that they can easily defeat it as a kind of flimsy straw man position. Basically, seeing relativism in those terms is a way of arguing against no one. For instance, I work in the academic world, and more specifically in the social sciences, which according to today's popular mythology is very close to the source and hotbed of that kind of relativism, most especially within the domain of postmodernism, poststructuralism, and critical theory. And yet, I've noticed that all of the specialists in those areas, even the most ardent ones, still stop at red traffic lights when they're driving. But why would they if they truly believe the idea that any interpretation or ethical decision is as good as any other one? Another thing I've noticed, they all wear clothes when they go to work, even when it's hot, and they'd probably rather not. But once again, why would they? You probably get the idea. So, the first problem with that view of relativism is that no one really believes it. At least not at the level where we actually live and breathe. The second problem is that I'd say that not one of those specialists I've encountered in the academic world would actually claim that any interpretation of a phenomenon is as good as any other one. Basically, the ideas they're exploring are very different from that, which we'll explore further in a minute or two. And finally, I've personally read a fair number of texts within the domain of postmodernism, poststructuralism, and to a lesser extent, critical theory. Yes, I've read Derrida and Foucault and Lacan and Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari, among others that populate the supposedly diabolical pantheon. Probably I haven't read enough to lay claim to any sort of thoroughgoing expertise in those areas, but I have read enough to have a basic working understanding knowledge of them. And personally, I don't find much actual evidence that those sorts of thinkers are advocating the kind of relativism that's commonly attributed to them. Often they'll suggest, implicitly or explicitly, that there are different ways of viewing any given phenomenon, but that's very different from claiming that all of those perspectives are equally valid or desirable. Basically, they're pursuing a kind of relativism, all right, but one which has very little to do with the demonizing straw man caricature of relativism that's now become fairly common within the domain of popular discourse. So at this point, the obvious question is, if that's true, then what form of relativism are they actually espousing? However, at this point, maybe I should take a minute to outline where my own allegiances lie, especially so you can know where I'm coming from at a more personal level. Like I said, I've definitely had some contact with postmodern thinkers, both past and current. But on the other hand, it's not where I live and breathe, neither as an intellectual nor as a human being. If you've been watching my videos in any kind of regular way, you're probably already well aware of where my intellectual home lies. It's in phenomenology, existentialism, humanistic psychology, and Buddhist thought. A fairly broad range of material that overlaps somewhat with things like postmodernism, but which is also very different from it, especially with respect to the question of subjectivity. But that's probably a topic for another video. Anyhow, the point is that while I have some first-hand familiarity with postmodern thought, I'm not a card-carrying, dyed-in-the-wool member of the club. Nor am I inclined to act as an apologist for its faults and excesses, which I think are very real, most especially among its latter-day acolytes. But on the other hand, I definitely perceive that the popular discourse about it, and about the relativism that's supposedly associated with it, is basically a gross and inaccurate oversimplification. Basically a ham-handed way of throwing out the intellectual baby with the ideological bathwater, so to speak. Anyhow, let's get back to the question of the kind of relativism that's actually prevalent in the academic world, which, as I said, is actually pretty different from what most people think it is. And I'd like to do that by way of a hopefully illustrative thought experiment. As you're watching me right now, it may seem like an obvious and common sense truth to say that my body isn't moving, at least not very much, and definitely not very fast. Well, the fact is that that would be an illusion, because in reality, I'm moving along with the Earth as it's turning on its axis. And since I'm making this video in the United States in Carrollton, Georgia, which is at 33.58 degrees north latitude, I'm actually moving at 863 miles an hour because of that. And for those of you who take delight in recreational mathematics, here's how to calculate that for your own latitude. It's just a simple trigonometry problem. But actually, now that you mention it, the fact that I'm moving at 863 miles an hour as I'm talking to you would also be an illusion, because the Earth is also orbiting the Sun, and it's doing that at a velocity of around 67,000 miles an hour. And of course, I'm moving along with it as I'm talking to you right now. Wow, 67,000 miles an hour, that's approximately 87 times the speed of sound. Sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? But actually, that's an illusion too, because the solar system is itself moving with respect to the center of the galaxy at around 470,000 miles an hour. And of course, our galaxy is moving away from most other galaxies at a tremendous velocity too, as well as away from the ultimate point of origin of all galaxies. So basically, depending upon your frame of reference, I'm either completely stationary or moving at 863 miles per hour, or at 67,000 miles per hour, or at 470,000 miles per hour, and so on. So which of those would be the absolute truth of my speed right now? Well, we could say that none of them is. Or we could say that they all are, and which one we call true depends upon the frame of reference we're using at the time. In other words, the question isn't so much, what is my actual velocity? Instead, the real question is, relative to what? And the idea that what seem to be the unassailable absolutes of the physical world are actually products of seeing things from particular perspectives and frames of reference was of course brought to much fuller fruition with the general theory of relativity more than a century ago, as well as by the numerous empirical observations that have confirmed and refined its validity since then. And according to the theory of relativity, even the seeming absolutes of mass and time actually turn out to be quantities that are relative to velocity, for instance. And close to the speed of light, mass and time vary considerably from the absolutes we thought they were during the centuries after Newton. Even long-hallowed canonical formulae like F equals ma, that's force equals mass times acceleration, turn out to be special cases whose truth is relevant only within particular relativistic frames of reference. In essence, our current understanding of how the physical world works is in terms of the relativism of relativity, as well as the train of insights that have followed in its wake. But of course, if that sort of relativism is true in the domain of simple physical matter, imagine how much more true it is in the comparatively complex domain of the human world, which in any case is inextricably bound up with the principles that govern the physical world, most obviously by way of our physical bodies. And I suppose that from a historical perspective, all of that makes a kind of sense. After all, the brilliant mathematization of the physical world accomplished by people like Newton eventually led to a similar mathematization of the human world, as in the case of behaviorism in the 20th century, for instance. So why would we be shocked and dismayed to discover that the relativistic understanding of the physical world from the early 20th century would now be yielding an analogous understanding of the human world in terms of our particular perspectives and frames of reference? But, of course, the human world is different from the world of inanimate objects in any number of ways. And one of the most important of them has to do with the ethical and moral dimensions of our lives. And seemingly, that's where most of the Sturm und Drang about relativism originates. But even in that sphere, isn't it already fairly obvious that the truth of any moral or ethical judgment is relative to our frames of reference for evaluating it? For instance, consider the example of what was for many centuries probably the most absolute moral injunction in the Western world, the ancient biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." And yet, when you think about it, the morality of killing is a very relative matter. It's relative to whether we're killing in self-defense or not, or in defense of someone else, or whether it's done in the context of a morally justifiable war, or whether we're killing animals as opposed to human beings. Of course, more recent biblical translations have tried to avoid those sorts of quandaries by rendering that commandment as "don't commit murder," or even "don't commit unjustifiable murder." But when you think about it, even the seeming absolute of murder is fraught with a degree of relativity. After all, in the United States we have two different types of murder, which vary relative to the degree of intent and premeditation involved, which in turn are relative to our perception of intent and premeditation. Furthermore, we evaluate cases of murder relative to whether aggravating or extenuating circumstances may be involved. And all of that still says nothing about how murder is defined and treated differently in other cultures or in other historical periods. Basically, it may seem like our prohibitions against killing and murder are monolithically absolute moral imperatives, but in reality, it turns out that they're full of all sorts of relative considerations, alternate definitions, and exculpatory exceptions. And in my own experience, that example illustrates exactly the kind of understanding of reality, moral and otherwise, that most so-called relativists are pursuing, at least in the academic world where I work. It's not about giving free license to demented serial killers because their morality is supposed to be equivalent to anything else in this world, but it is a way of pointing out that, like the relativistic truths of the objective material world, the truths of morality and moral action appear to us as functions of our frames of reference. In other words, it's a kind of understanding where the obvious contingencies that the objective world imposes on us are always in a kind of intimate relationship with our subjective and intersubjective experience of them, and vice versa. It's a way of simultaneously recognizing and honoring both sides of reality, both the objective side of things and the subjective side. But once again, the main point is that that sort of relativism doesn't automatically mean that everything has to be chaotically arbitrary and capricious, any more than it means that everything has to be immutably deterministic and absolute. Rather, it's about understanding things in terms of the middle ground between those extremes, which is actually where we spend most of our lives. And that middle ground is nothing other than the ongoing, ever-evolving confluence of objectivity and subjectivity. Basically, the dynamism that plays out between the rigorous demands of the objective world and the inevitable relativism of human perception and human freedom. So, then, the obvious question is, Why then is there so much weeping and gnashing of teeth about relativism these days? Why has it become practically a dirty word within popular discourse and in certain intellectual circles? Well, I suspect all of that's ultimately circulating around a kind of underlying anxiety and sense of insecurity, especially among people who feel much safer when the world seems to be governed by the stability and predictability of monolithic absolutes. The worry is that if we acknowledge that our perception of morality, among other things, is inevitably shaped by the relativity of our personal, cultural, and historical perspectives, then the motivation to behave ethically and morally will naturally be compromised in the process. And in turn, there'll be very little reason for us to live responsible, meaningful lives, which of course would be extremely unhealthy and degenerative both for Western civilization and for humanity more generally. To say nothing of our lives in the microcosm. But are those sorts of anxieties really justified? After all, when you think about a lot of the worst, most morally reprehensible and murderous eras in human history, things like the mass genocides under Stalin, Mao, and Hitler, or more historically distant events like witch burnings, inquisitions, and crusades, is it really true that those sorts of phenomena grew out of seeing morality in mostly relativistic terms that would acknowledge that there are many possible frames of reference? Or would it be more accurate to say that their actual root was mostly about seeing the world in the exact opposite way, mostly in starkly absolutist terms, and more specifically in terms of the supposedly absolute correctness of someone's ideological vision and its correspondingly absolute moral ordering of the world? Things like the obviously unquestionable ideal of the brotherhood of the proletariat, or perhaps that of the inherent superiority of the Aryan race. In my view, it's pretty obviously the latter case. And if you don't buy that, try watching Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will with its thousands upon thousands of serried ranks of fervent Nazi soldiers arranged in perfect geometric symmetry, and ask yourself how many indicators of moral relativism you're noticing in it, and how much moral absolutism there seems to be. And if your reaction is that, well, it's all about moral relativism because the Nazis had an incorrect view of the absolute truth, especially in contrast to my own, well, isn't that pretty much how the Nazis themselves were thinking at the time? Basically, if our anxiety is about repeating historical cataclysms like those, well, we shouldn't be worrying too much about relativists because relativists recognize that there are always many possible ways of seeing and interpreting life. If we're really worried about generating hell on earth, we should be anxious about people who obstinately refuse to see things in relativistic terms. We should worry about all of the world's true believers who have somehow convinced themselves of the absolute and singular correctness of their cause, and whose project is consequently to bend everyone else to their own non-relativistic worldview, and to coerce them by violence whenever necessary. But at this point, one may well ask, okay, but what about morality at the more microcosmic end of the spectrum? Certainly moral absolutes are necessary if we're going to behave like kind, decent human beings in the small moments of our lives. But here too, I find that monolithic moral imperatives actually play very little role in all of that, at least for most people. For instance, consider something as commonplace as holding doors open for other people. In my estimation, very few of us do that because of our sense of feeling compelled to fulfill some sort of moral absolute. Instead, most of us do it out of a combination of two things. First, it's a matter of social convention, which of course is a very relative thing. And second, we do it simply out of our sense of basic human kindness, which of course varies relative to each person. But the point is that our supposed dependence on absolutes doesn't actually seem all that necessary for moral conduct at the level of our everyday lives either. And as for the related issue of whether relativism or absolutism is more conducive to helping us develop a deep and abiding sense of responsibility, as well as the capacity to live truly meaningful, worthwhile lives, well, is it really true that seeing everything in terms of some sort of all-encompassing monolithic absolute actually helps that process along? Because from what I can see, the exact opposite more frequently seems to be the case. That's because the habit of automatically deferring to some sort of absolute tends to shut down one of the fundamental challenges of life, which is first to become perceptive enough to see deeply into a range of possible alternatives, and then to become responsible enough to pick one that's genuinely meaningful and worthwhile. That is, we have to become responsible for however we're going to see reality, morally and otherwise, rather than just behaving like slavish puppets dancing mechanically on the strings of some absolute truth out there. In other words, we have to become truly discerning and truly daring in our souls. We have to learn to see deeply enough into all of life's complex regions of relativity to create a distinctly meaningful and powerful destiny for ourselves. One that's not cookie-cuttered out for us, but which is the creative product of our responsible and meaningful engagement with the world around us. But hey, that's just me, talking from my own relativistic frame of reference. And as always, your own results may be very different relative to mine. After all, the truth of relativism is itself relative, and you're consequently allowed to think and believe in whatever suits you best. Anyhow, in my next video, I'll probably do a complete 180 and defend the value of seeing things in terms of absolutes. That's because my meta-belief is that the best kind of understanding happens when we consider multiple perspectives on things, rather than just one. Until then, thanks as always for watching, and take care of your soul. Bye-bye.